Welcome back to Irons Through the Ages. Last week we saw Charlie Paynter rebuild the club through the 1930s, culminating in West Ham winning their first ever trophy, the Football League War Cup, in 1940, a victory celebrated quietly before the players returned to their military units. Today, we pick up where the war left off. Football resumed in 1945, and the great West Ham squad that Paynter had assembled, the one that had been on the verge of promotion to the First Division in 1939, found that 6 years had passed, their best players had aged, and the world had changed in ways nobody had quite expected. The 15 years that follow are not West Ham's most celebrated period. They spent most of them in the Second Division, without silverware, without consistent promotion challenges. A lesser podcast might skip over them. But I think they matter enormously, because in these years, quietly, persistently, almost invisibly, the foundations were being laid for something that would define this club for the next 60 years. This is episode 5, The Long Road Back. When the Second World War ended in the summer of 1945, England looked around at itself and found a world transformed. The East End of London had been bombed with particular ferocity. The Blitz, the V-1 flying bombs, the V-2 rockets. Entire streets had been razed. Communities had been scattered. The docks, which had defined East London's economy for generations, had been targeted repeatedly and left in varying states of damage and disarray. The returning servicemen came home to streets that sometimes no longer existed, houses that weren't there, neighbours who hadn't made it back. The work of rebuilding, physically, socially, psychologically, would take years. In some ways, it would take decades. Football resumed for the 1945-46 season, initially in a transitional League South competition before the Football League proper returned in 1946-47. And West Ham United, like every other club, found themselves assessing the human cost of 6 years of war. The squad Paynter had carefully assembled was now a different beast. Many players' best years had been lost to the war, and they returned to football older and irrevocably changed. And the physical fabric of Upton Park itself bore the marks of conflict. The South Bank stand had been damaged by a parachute mine in 1944. Repairs were needed everywhere. The stadium that the club had occupied since 1904 had survived, but it had not survived unscathed. The players who came back found a strange kind of temporal dislocation. They had been footballers in 1939. Now it was 1945. The game had been suspended, but they hadn't been frozen in time. They had been at war, which meant they had aged, been physically damaged in some cases, and in many cases had spent years doing things so far removed from football that the return to the pitch felt both natural and surreal. Players like elegant wing-half Archie Macaulay and centre-half Dick Walker returned to the club 6 years older, their peak years interrupted. Walker would become the backbone of the post-war defence, a model of the steady excellence West Ham has always depended on, but the team struggled to regain its pre-war momentum. These men deserved better than the circumstances history handed them. But they played on as the people of East London rebuilt around them, and the football, however imperfect, however truncated, provided the rhythm of the week that the community had always needed. The post-war seasons were sobering. West Ham were competitive in the Second Division, but never quite made the jump. The reasons were complex: depleted finances, a game that had tactically moved on, and a simple transition between generations of players. In 1950, after 53 years of service to West Ham in various capacities, manager Charlie Paynter stepped down. He was 71 years old. He passed away in 1969, having spent more than half his life at the club he saved. Before we move on to Paynter's successor, it's worth spending a little time with what Paynter had actually achieved, because the summary verdict of his tenure, if you look at it superficially, is underwhelming. He managed West Ham for 17 years, won one wartime trophy, and never achieved promotion back to the First Division. That looks, on the surface, like a modest record. But surface verdicts miss almost everything that mattered. Paynter inherited a club in crisis. In 1932, at 33, his first full season in charge, West Ham finished 20th in the Second Division, 1 point above relegation to the third tier. He had a sacked predecessor who had just died by suicide. He had an ageing squad, depleted finances, and a fan base that had just endured the humiliation of a record relegation from the First Division. His brief was essentially, Don't let this get any worse. He didn't just stop the rot. He rebuilt. Patiently, methodically, with the local knowledge of a man who had spent his entire adult life in Plaistow. He found players like Len Goulden, like Sam Small, like Archie Macaulay. He built a team capable of challenging for promotion in 1939-40 before the war intervened. He won the War Cup. He gave the club, when it might have collapsed entirely, a sense of identity and purpose that survived everything the 1930s threw at it. And he did something else that is harder to quantify, but perhaps more important than anything else. He established and deepened the tradition of developing local players at the club. He made the connection between West Ham United and its immediate community, the East End streets, the local schools, the small clubs where East London's footballing talent first showed itself. Something that wasn't just incidental, but systematic. The club's relationship with its community wasn't an accident under Paynter. It was a policy. In 1950, the man he handed over to was someone who had lived inside that tradition his entire career. Ted Fenton had been signed as a young West Ham player by Sid King. He had learned the game at Upton Park, played for the club, managed in the lower divisions, and was now coming home to take charge. He was, in every meaningful sense, a product of what Paynter had built. The handover felt natural. The continuity was real. And what Fenton would do with that inheritance would eventually produce something extraordinary. To understand what Fenton was inheriting, and what he was eventually going to help change, you need to understand what English football looked and felt like in the early 1950s. English football in the early 1950s was physical and direct, played at pace on heavy pitches. While attendances were at a record high, with the country hungry for normalcy, the game itself was not thoughtful. Effort was valued over tactical sophistication. Edward Ben Fenton was born in Forest Gate in 1914, less than 2 miles from Upton Park. He had been signed by Sid King as a young player in the early 1930s and had grown up inside West Ham United's culture, absorbing its values, its style, its relationship with the community. When Paynter retired in 1950, Fenton was working as manager of Colchester United, having led them successfully through their transition to Football League membership. He was 36 years old, experienced and ready. His appointment felt, to everyone who knew the club, like the obvious thing to do. Here was a man who had been formed by West Ham, who understood what the club stood for, and who had the managerial skills to take it forward. The board backed him, the supporters welcomed him, and Fenton quietly began the work. His early seasons in charge were a continuation of the Paynter-era pattern, solid but unspectacular second division finishes. 8th in 1950-51, 11th in 1951-52. The results were modest, but something was happening underneath the surface. Fenton was building a coaching structure. He was investing in the youth system with even more deliberate intent than Paynter had. He was creating, very consciously, the conditions for a particular kind of footballer to emerge from Upton Park. Not just technically proficient, thoughtful, intelligent about the game, capable of playing and talking about football in ways that went beyond instinct and effort. And he was bringing in people who could help him do that. Most notably, a young and ferociously intelligent player signed from Charlton Athletic in 1951. His name was Malcolm Allison. Malcolm Allison arrived at West Ham in 1951, signed from Charlton Athletic as a centre-half. He was 23 years old, physically imposing, intensely ambitious, and absolutely obsessed with football as a thinking person's game. He had already, at that age, developed an almost academic interest in tactics, coaching methods, and the continental approaches to the game that he was reading about and, where possible, watching. Allison was a force of nature, loud, confident, charismatic, argumentative. He dominated any room he walked into. He was also, in football terms, ahead of his time. He had read the work of Hungarian coaches. He had absorbed the ideas that were circulating in European football about the possibilities of what the game could be when it was properly coached and properly thought through. And at West Ham, he found others who shared his hunger. In a café on Berlin Road called Cassettari's, a remarkable group formed around Allison to drink tea and talk football for hours. It included future managers like Noel Cantwell, Frank O'Farrell, John Bond, Dave Sexton, and Andy Nelson. This was a culture of thinking about football, of questioning received wisdom. And hovering at the edges of this group, as a youth player, was a teenager from Barking named Bobby Moore. It's worth dwelling on this café culture for a moment, because it tells you something essential about how the West Ham philosophy of this era actually worked. This wasn't a manager descending from on high with a coaching manual and telling players what to think. It was the players themselves, gathered in a café, self-organized, driven by genuine curiosity, working out how the game should be played. The conversations ranged across everything, the WM formation and its limitations, the possibilities of different shapes, different approaches. And then, in November 1953, they were handed the most powerful possible argument for why English football needed to change. Then, in November 1953, came a catalyst. Hungary beat England 6-3 at Wembley, playing a fluid, intelligent style that made England's rigid formation look obsolete. While the English football establishment dismissed the result, the players at Cassettari's café saw the future. Their question became, how do we play like that? Through the mid-1950s, West Ham's league position began to improve. Fenton was finding his best 11. The philosophy emerging from those training ground conversations and café debates was starting to show on the pitch. The football was better, more coherent, more purposeful, more recognisably intelligent than the standard second division fare. In 1954-55, West Ham finished 8th. In 1955-56, they rose to 4th. In 1956-57, a promising third-place finish, just missing out on promotion. For the second time in the club's history, the first being the late 1930s, West Ham seemed perpetually poised on the threshold of the top flight, unable to cross it. And then came 1957-58, the season that finally did it. The squad that delivered promotion was built on local talent and the new philosophy. Forwards, Vic Keeble and John Dick provided the goals, but at the heart of it all was the intelligent full-back partnership of John Bond and Noel Cantwell, who personified everything the Cassettari's conversations had been building toward. The season started well and gathered momentum as the months passed. West Ham were playing confident, organised football, winning matches at Upton Park, grinding out results away. The Berlin ground crowd sensed something different about this team, a purposefulness, a togetherness, a sense that they were heading somewhere. Going into the final weeks of the 1957-58 season, West Ham and Blackburn Rovers were neck and neck at the top of the second division. Both clubs wanted promotion. Only the top two were guaranteed to go up. Every match mattered. Upton Park in those final weeks was electric. The ground held around 30,000 for big matches, and the crowds that came for the promotion run-in were not just large but fevered, tight-packed on the terraces, crackling with the particular intensity of people who have been waiting a long time for something and can see it getting closer. West Ham held their nerve. They won the matches they needed to win. On the final day, they confirmed promotion in second place behind Blackburn Rovers. The second division was done. After 26 years away from the top flight, 26 years, West Ham United were going back to the first division. 26 years. A generation. There were men in the crowd that day who had been boys when West Ham were last in the first division. Their fathers had stood on those terraces in the 1920s, watching Vic Watson score goals in the era of the White Horse Final. Now, they had brought their own sons, and together they were watching something their generation had never seen. West Ham United, back at the top table. The scenes at the final whistle were extraordinary. Players carried off the pitch, supporters swarming onto the turf, strangers embracing, grown men crying without embarrassment. The songs rising from the Berlin ground into the East London evening sky. 26 years, and it had been worth every single one of them. Ted Fenton resigned as West Ham United manager in March 1961, about 2.5 years after achieving promotion. He was in ill health, and the timing was unfortunate. He left before what would become West Ham's greatest era fully flowered. Fenton's legacy is immense. He didn't just win promotion, he created the conditions for everything that followed. The coaching culture, the youth system, and the recruitment of Bobby Moore. When Ron Greenwood arrived as Fenton's replacement in April 1961, he wasn't inventing the Academy of Football philosophy. He was inheriting it. Fenton had prepared the soil for what would become West Ham's greatest era. The phrase Academy of Football, though associated with Ron Greenwood, describes a culture that had been building for decades. It wasn't a literal building, but a set of values. That football should be played with intelligence and technique, that young players should be developed patiently, as people, not just athletes, and that the club's bond with its community was essential. This philosophy was radical for its time. This culture manifested in the club's scouting. West Ham scouts looked not for the fastest or strongest boys, but for intelligence, decision-making, and a capacity to learn. This produced a consistent type of player, and its most obvious product was Bobby Moore, a player of limited pace who became one of the world's greatest defenders through sheer intelligence, positioning, and technical mastery. Moore was not an accident. He was the product of a philosophy. In 1957, Malcolm Allison's playing career was ended by tuberculosis at age 29. He, along with Dave Sexton, John Bond, Noel Cantwell, and Franco Farrell, went on to become hugely influential managers. The men of the Cassettari's café dispersed across English football, taking the West Ham way with them. This new philosophy was nurtured in a ground that was inseparable from its community. Upton Park sat in a dense residential neighbourhood, and that intimacy was its strength. The players weren't remote figures. They were men of the neighbourhood, playing for the neighbourhood. This era is personified by Noel Cantwell, an elegant Irish fullback and a central figure in the Cassettari's group. He was intelligent, graceful, and technically assured, a footballer who made everyone around him better, the purest expression of the Academy's ideals. This bond was never clearer than on the night promotion was confirmed in 1958. After 26 long years, the victory was more than a sporting achievement. It was a reunion across generations. People stood in the streets for hours, not because of an organised party, but because they wanted to be near others who understood what it meant. It was the oldest story at West Ham, a community and its club, bound together. The 15 years between the end of the war and the 1958 promotion are, on their surface, the least dramatic chapter in West Ham United's history. No cup finals, no great titles, no legendary players whose names have echoed down the decades. But underneath the surface, in a café on Berlin Road, something was happening that would change English football. A group of players, thinking harder about the game than anyone expected footballers to think, were developing ideas that would eventually produce the most celebrated era in this club's history, and scatter their influence across the football world through the coaches and managers they became. In 1958, West Ham United returned to the First Division after 26 years away. Ted Fenton had done what Paynter had set the stage for, and now the question was, what could they do up there? Next week, on Episode 6, The Answer. The early 1960s, Ron Greenwood takes over. The Academy of Football is given its name and its fullest expression. Bobby Moore emerges as the most complete defender England has ever produced. And somewhere in the youth team, two forwards are developing who will change the game forever. You know their names, but the full story of how they got there is extraordinary. Until then, thank you for listening. Come on, you Irons.